Born at the start of the 20th century, you grew up before the Great Depression was a history lesson. It was your daily reality. Imagine being a child and watching your father not just lose his job, but lose everything that made your family feel safe. The savings vanished, the house went, and with them, the quiet assumption that next year would naturally be better than this one. You learned quickly that the world wasn't interested in your comfort. Meals were stretched as far as possible. One pot of food became 3 nights of dinner. Clothes were passed down until they barely held together. You wore your older brother's shoes long after they stopped fitting because there wasn't another pair coming. You didn't demand more. You could see the cost of more written on your parents' faces. And just as you were stepping into adulthood, the world demanded something else from you, a war. World War II didn't just frame your 20s, it forged your identity. At 18, you could be climbing into a landing craft heading for a foreign beach. At 19, you might be flying missions over Europe. If you stayed home, you took extra shifts in factories, stood in ration lines, grew food in your own yard, and went to bed with your hands aching. When an entire generation endures the same crushing hardship together, it reshapes them. It makes them tougher, not necessarily colder, but unshakably resilient. For you, this wasn't philosophy. It was just life. This is why this generation is often seen as emotionally distant. It's not that they lacked deep feelings, it's that, in their world, emotions were optional. Survival was not. You didn't process your trauma. You boxed it up, pushed it down, and kept going. There was work to do and people depending on you. Out of this came a particular mindset psychologists might call a quiet practical stoicism. Hardship is normal. Complaining changes nothing. What matters is your next action. And that mindset gave you remarkable strengths. You could live with uncertainty without falling apart. You could suffer real loss and still get up the next morning and go back to work. You didn't require life to be fair, only for the task in front of you to be clear. You carried this into factories, into offices, into your marriages and family life. And without intending to, you passed a diluted version of this toughness to every generation that came after you. The silent generation, 1928 to 1945, you were born into a world already damaged. Your earliest memories are shaped by the tail end of the Depression. You might remember your mother boiling the same bones twice to stretch a soup, your father leaving in the dark of early morning to look for work and returning with empty hands. If you lived in Oklahoma, Texas, or Kansas, the sky itself could become terrifying. At noon, daylight could vanish as huge dust storms swallowed entire towns. Your mother might have pressed damp cloths over your baby sister's nose and mouth just so she could breathe. Families loaded what little they had onto trucks and drove west on Route 66, only to be turned away at the state line. You learned early that questions didn't make you safer. The adults didn't have answers, and drawing attention to yourself rarely ended well. So you learned to watch, to listen, and to stay quiet. Then came another global war. You saw the men around you leaving older brothers, cousins, neighbors. Not all of them returned. You sat with your family around the radio, listening to names of distant cities and battlefields you'd never heard of, realizing that the world was bigger and more dangerous than anyone had prepared you for. By the time peace returned, a lesson had already sunk deep. Keep your head down. Don't provoke. Don't attract trouble. You saw what happened to people who stood out, who pushed too hard, who challenged those in charge. Then McCarthyism arrived. The Red Scare. It wasn't just about communists. It was about anyone who looked suspicious, thought differently, or asked uncomfortable questions. Teachers lost their jobs over books they read. Actors and writers were blacklisted over old meetings or friendships. People turned on their neighbors. You learned that even in peacetime, a careless word or the wrong association could wreck your entire life. When silence means safety, you learn silence, not as a tactic, but as instinct. This is why the silent generation tended to follow rules so closely. Not because they lacked creativity or passion, but because they had watched what happened to people who didn't. They prioritized stability over self-expression. They took the secure position, married young, stayed with the same employer for decades. This built a generation known for reliability, duty, showing up, doing the work, and not asking for applause. While later generations raised their voices, protested, and tried to transform the system. The silent generation was often the one quietly keeping everyday life functioning. Baby boomers, 1946 to 1964. You entered a world that looked like it had finally turned a corner. The war was over. Factories were humming. Your parents had survived scarcity and global conflict, and they craved nothing more than normal steady jobs, small houses with yards, and children. Lots of children. So here you came in record numbers. New suburbs spread across the map. Highways cut through cities and countrysides. Televisions flickered on in living rooms across the country. For the first time in a long time, the future looked like something to chase rather than simply outlast. But under all that post-war optimism sat a quiet fear. You practiced duck and cover drills at school, hiding under desks as if that could stop a nuclear blast. You watched your parents follow the Cuban Missile Crisis on the evening news, their forced calm, unable to fully hide their anxiety. You learned that the world really could end in one blinding moment and that you were supposed to keep doing your homework anyway. Then the fractures became impossible to ignore. You sat glued to the television as Walter Cronkite struggled to announce that President Kennedy had been shot. A few years later, Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. 2 months after that, Bobby Kennedy, 3 assassinations in 5 years. At 18, you might have been drafted into a war that felt senseless. Vietnam wasn't World War II. There was no clean narrative, no singular evil villain, no clear finish line. Just dense jungles, guerrilla fighters, and statistics on the nightly news that didn't match the government's optimistic statements. It was the first war many Americans watched in real time from their living rooms. Night after night, you saw footage that contradicted official claims of progress. Whether you went to Vietnam or marched against it, it changed you. You realized that the institutions your parents trusted without question were capable of lying or of being disastrously wrong. That realization rearranged your relationship with authority. For you, distrust of leadership wasn't an abstract political idea. It was tied to coffins coming home while officials insisted victory was close. And yet, here's the paradox. The same generation that challenged the system eventually took control of it. The young people who embraced counterculture, marched for civil rights, demanded women's liberation, and rallied for environmental protection later became CEOs, politicians, and leaders in every major institution. They built a consumer society on a scale the world had never seen. Boomers, as a group, became masters of reinvention. As the culture shifted from analog to digital, from industrial to information, they adapted, repackaged themselves, and kept moving. It's one reason so many of them are still in leadership roles, still working, still reluctant to fully step aside. Change has been the backdrop of their entire lives, and they've been adjusting to it since they were young. If you were born in the late 50s or early 60s, the standard boomer story never quite felt like yours. You weren't at Woodstock. You didn't march in the early landmark protests. You were the younger kid, watching it all happen on television, old enough to absorb the images, too young to participate. Your daily life might have looked fairly comfortable TV shows with tidy families, dinner at the table, parents telling you the world was full of possibility. Your older siblings said society was changing, that everything was opening up. Then Watergate happened. You were a teenager, maybe, sitting in front of the TV as you watched a president deny wrongdoing, get exposed on tape, and resign before being removed. Watergate wasn't just politics. It was the moment you realized in real time that leaders could lie for years and nearly get away with it. Your older siblings had Vietnam as their defining struggle to fight in or to resist. By the time you were old enough to be drafted, the war was over. The cause that had given their generation a clear identity wasn't yours to claim. When you turned 18, you got your driver's license and then sat in endless lines at gas stations during the oil crisis. You heard new words: oil embargo, energy crisis, stagflation. Prices were rising while opportunities seemed to shrink. By the time you were ready to buy a house, interest rates had exploded to record highs. The older boomers had already bought in, secured jobs with benefits, and staked out their place in the economy. You were left wondering where your piece of the dream had gone. That's why this cohort is often called Generation Jones, jonesing for something always just out of reach. You inherited the optimism of earlier boomers, but not the same timing or rewards. So you adjusted. You stopped assuming the system would deliver what it promised. You took what you could get, improvised, and built a life in the gaps. You became a bridge generation too young to fully belong to the classic boomer era, too old to be Gen X. You occupied the in-between space, mostly overlooked. Yet you still managed to carve out careers, raise families, and keep moving forward without many of the guarantees the generation before you enjoyed. Generation X, 1965 to 1980, you grew up coming home to a quiet house. There was no smartphone in your pocket, no constant stream of messages from your parents asking where you were. You had a key on a string around your neck, let yourself inside, made a snack, and figured out the rest of the afternoon alone. Maybe you watched TV. Maybe you roamed the neighborhood on your bike. Maybe you got into things you shouldn't have and had to figure out how to fix your own mess. That was just normal life. Your parents were working, and that meant you were responsible for yourself. This formed a deep pattern in your psychology. If there's a problem, you deal with it. No one is coming to rescue you. Along with that responsibility came something kids today rarely experience: real, untracked freedom. No GPS, no social media, no constant digital footprint. You could leave the house on a Saturday morning and not return until the streetlights snapped on, and nobody panicked. In between, you explored, you built secret forts, you biked to places your parents didn't even know existed. You drank from garden hoses. You learned how far you could go before you really would get into trouble. And when you messed up as a teenager, it usually stayed in the past. There was no camera recording every mistake, no permanent online record of every reckless comment or bad decision. You got to experiment with identity in relative privacy. That space allowed you to grow without the world constantly watching. But your story wasn't all freedom and long summer days. You also saw economic fear up close. You watched your parents deal with the early 80s recession, the 1987 stock market crash, and waves of layoffs and corporate right-sizing. You might remember the quiet tones at the kitchen table, the stack of bills, the calculations about what to cut. Even if you didn't grasp the details, you understood the mood. By the time you stepped into the job market in the early 90s, another downturn was waiting. You discovered quickly that the idea of a job for life was already obsolete. You realized being loyal to a company didn't mean it would be loyal to you. Hard work was necessary, but not a shield against layoffs. Security was fragile. This didn't make you lazy, it made you realistic. You learned to work hard while staying detached enough to walk away if you had to. You kept your resume updated, learned new skills, and stayed ready for change, not because you didn't care about your work, but because you knew you couldn't fully rely on any single organization to protect you. People sometimes call this cynicism. For Gen X, it's more like clear-eyed practicality. You grew up knowing, on some level, that no one was coming to save you, so you became the kind of person who saves yourself.